Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk, where today's topic is Transportation Management Configuration Deep Dive, Rating, and Routing. My name is Evan, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams Live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation, and by participating in the session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout the event. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now let's get started. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Nicole Gump, Senior Program Manager. Nicole, over to you.
Thanks, Evan. Welcome, everyone. As Evan mentioned, our topic today is transportation management, configuration related to rating and routing. So we are talking about the transportation management module within Dynamics 365 for supply chain management. And just as a disclaimer, today we will be talking about the rating and routing configurations within the transportation management module, and we will not be covering any configurations that require integrations to an external system, such as small parcel shipping. So let's review our agenda. We will cover some core configurations for the rating and routing setups. We will then talk about their functionality. And then we'll go through some tips and tricks, really best practices for setting up those various configuration forms within the system. And I will actually be getting into a demo environment with some Contoso data to review those. So let's get started. So for our core configurations, the first one that I want to talk about is within our transportation management parameters. So these are our module level parameters. The first thing that we need to do, and this is only applicable when we first set up a new environment, but we want to go into our transportation management parameters and click this button that says initialize base engine data. And we need to do that for all of our engines that are within the transportation management module to be able to be populated with all of the kind of default information so that the users are not having to set up all of those engines manually. So that's just a one-time setup anytime you have a new environment. And then when we start looking at the configurations for rating, all of these things together. So our rating profiles, our rate masters, our rate base assignments, our rate bases, and really that contains our break masters as well. All of those things together define what I'm calling the query structure for our rating engines. So when we initialize or trigger a rate within the transportation management system, it is going through this query structure or this logic of all of these different configuration forms to eventually, return a result to us, which is an actual freight charge or a rate for what we are rating. And then similarly, when we talk about routing, we've got routing guides, routing plans, and route schedules that all work together to define that same kind of query structure for our routing operations. So again, when we initialize a route within transportation management, the system is going to go through, evaluate the logic and all of these different setup forms and return a routing result to us. So those are our core configurations for rating and routing. So let's talk a little bit more about those conceptually. and how those different configuration forms are related. So if we start with rating, I've got a visual here, and this is really trying to depict the relationship between the different configuration forms. So think of this as a pyramid, a sideways pyramid, where the rating profile on the far left-hand side is the top of the pyramid. So we start with a rating profile which contains a relationship to our rate master, and that is in a one-to-one relationship. So for every rating profile I set up, I have one rate master that I am tying to that profile. So if I go to the next level in my hierarchy or in my pyramid, within that rate master, I have a one-to-many relationship now with my rate base assignments. So that is the next level down. And so if we go one more level into our rate base assignments, we've got a one-to-one relationship. On every rate base assignment, I am going to identify one rate base. And then finally, at the bottom of our pyramid here, within that rate base, I've got a one-to-one relationship again between my rate base and my break masters. So this is showing the relationship, and it's important to note that as you are working with these different configuration forms, if you're going to configure a new, rating profile and all of these related configurations from scratch, you really don't want to start with the rating profile at the top of the pyramid because it is dependent on all of these things underneath of it. Really, we want to start in reverse. So we would start by configuring our break master. That way, when we go up to the next level and we're defining our rate base, we have got a break master value to select and all the way back up the chain, right? I need my rate bases to define on my assignment, and I need my assignments within my master, which then I select on my profile. So we want to work in reverse when we are setting these configurations up. So let's talk about the similar concept and relationships for routing. So with routing, a few less levels to our pyramid here, but we are still going to start here on the far left with our routing guide. That's the first form that is evaluated. And the routing guide has a many-to-one potentially relationship with our routing plan. And I say potentially, and you see my asterisk there. And the asterisk is for if our routing plan is tied to a route schedule. So if I have a defined schedule that I've generated for my route, then I can only tie that plan to one routing guide. In all other instances, if I'm not using scheduled routes, I can assign the same route plan to multiple guides. So if we drill one more level into our pyramid here, if we look at our routing plans, they contain a couple of things. They're going to contain many segments, so one routing plan to many segments. And they may also contain those route schedules that I just spoke about. And the route schedules can be a one-to-many relationship on the plan as well. So I may have a route schedule that runs every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, right? So I'm going to have many scheduled routes within that one route plan. And then if we go to our lowest level within routing, so if we look at our relationship between our segments, and their lowest level is the hubs that we define in transportation management. And these are just your origin and your destination points within that segment of the route. You can define hub types that are relevant to your business and your transportation network, but they might be things like warehouses or ports or rail yards or consolidation points, right? A freight forwarder, whatever that hub may be, you can define those, and they're going to have a one-to-many relationship with every segment, right? Because we've at least got an origin and a destination hub within every segment. And then if we look at the route schedules, Their relationship at the lowest level is to those individual scheduled routes, which is going to be a one-to-many relationship. As I described earlier, if I set up a schedule that runs every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and that weekly recurrence happens, within a specified time frame, then I'm going to have all of those routes, even if it's just 1 week, right? I've got 3 routes for Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So that's our one-to-many relationship with the route schedule. So again, as we're configuring, we would want to make sure that we have our hubs defined before we create our segments within our route plan. And then we've got our route plan that we can tie to our routing guide. So we kind of work in reverse to make sure we've got all the dependent configurations set up. So our next section is going to talk about some tips and some best practices for setting up each of these different configuration forms in the system. So we'll start with rating, and I've got a picture here. It's a little bit condensed, but we're going to jump into the system to review these forms as well. So the first one is the rating profile. So we're going to kind of start at the top of our pyramid here again as we walk through these. With the rating profile, which is what I have a picture of on the right-hand side, our tip is to leave the site and warehouse values blank as you're creating these profiles. And you can see that that's true in my screen capture I have here. The reason we give that tip is specific to the phases of your implementation, pre-production or pre-go live. Because as you're initially configuring, designing, testing the system, if we start to identify specific sites and warehouses on these profiles, then that limits the use of that profile throughout the system, right? So if you leave these kind of open-ended and you start testing your rating functionality, then it's going to be easier for the system to determine which rating profile it can use. Certainly, if you do have a profile that is specific to a certain site and warehouse, or maybe a site and all of that site's associated warehouses, you can start to define those in your production environment. But for the purposes of testing and kind of helping you troubleshoot as well as you're testing the rating scenarios, that you just go ahead and leave these blank to begin with. And then our next level down in our pyramid was that rate master. And on the rate master, our tip is to verify the rating metadata. So the metadata is going to be populated by that first action that we talked about back when we defined the core configurations. So when you go into the transportation management parameters and you click on that initialize base engine data, one of the things it's doing is setting up this rating metadata. And really that's just a fancy way to say, which fields are required for me to populate on my rate base assignments and on my rate base. So what are those mandatory kind of lookup values that are going to be needed? And then our next level down from the rate master is our rate base assignments. And again, we might have many of these in every rate master. So these each have an effective date. Every single rate base assignment has an effective start date and end date. Again, we just ask or recommend that you leave those dates blank as you're early on in your implementation and you're testing with this functionality. Because if you start to set them, especially if you set them early on, say with some initial configuration, and you go back later in the project lifecycle and now you're testing, and maybe those initial dates you put in here are no longer effective, and you're wondering why you are trying to rate and it's kind of returning an error. A lot of times those rating errors are quite vague. So it's just making the troubleshooting much harder, but these can certainly cause an issue, right, if you're outside of those effective dates in your testing. So go ahead and leave them blank. It's just going to make your life a little bit easier. And we've got the same tip for the rate bases. So once you go into the rate base assignment, you've got a rate base that actually defines the rate right at the lowest level. They also have, every individual rate base has an effective start date and end date as well. Again, go ahead and leave them blank because hopefully you're starting to see a pattern of, these effective dates kind of compound right as we drill further into the configuration. And even if you have a mismatch between the levels, right? I've got a rate base that has certain effective dates and my assignment has different effective dates, that can also cause an issue. So in order to avoid that kind of tedious troubleshooting of just those dates, go ahead and leave them blank as you're testing. I will note that probably when you want to fill those in would be if you have got a contracted rate for your carrier, say it's an LTL carrier that you use, you've got negotiated rates with them and you're going to put them into the system. You may want to go ahead when you go into production and you're going live, populate these effective dates because you may know, the beginning and end date for that contract with the carrier. And maybe it gets renegotiated twice a year or yearly. So that's where those effective dates start to come into play because now I can see the trends over time of my carrier contracted rates if I start to manage those effective dates going forward in production. And then finally on rating is the break master. So that's that kind of very lowest level configuration form. And this one, our tip is to make sure when you set up a new break master that you're choosing the right data type for the unit that you're using to break by. So an example would be if my unit that I am breaking by is weight, then I wouldn't want to select the data type that's like a string value, right? I would want a numerical value for that weight. So let's go ahead. I'm going to bring up the demo environment so we can talk about these in each of their individual forms in the system. So let me refresh there. This is our rating profile. So again, we're kind of back at the top of that pyramid. I had a link that brought me directly to this form from the slide that we were on, but I will show you how to get there. Within transportation management, setup, and rating, we can get directly to the rating profile form that I am on here. Okay, so once we're in here, again, we mentioned leaving the site and warehouse values blank because as we start to define, maybe for my ocean carrier, that applies to everything in site 3. And I could even go down and specify within site 3, maybe it's only for this specific warehouse. So if I do that, that's great if that applies to my business scenario. But as I'm testing, if I have this defined and now if I've got another site or even another warehouse within my site 3 that I want to try to rate with this ocean rating profile, it's no longer going to pick up this record here, because I've specified that it's only for site 3 and warehouse 32. So you can see how that would start to generate the need for more records in here, more rating profiles. If I'm being that specific, I would need to set up another ocean rating profile that maybe has a different site and warehouse indicated here. So leaving them blank, again, just allows you to use it across your sites and warehouses for that same profile. And I will point out here, if I scroll all the way to the right, we mentioned this tip for a couple of other configuration forms, but it is also at this very highest level on the rating profile. So you've got these effective start and end dates. So you can see that they're blank. And I think we've discussed why that is just going to make your life easier for troubleshooting. So we leave those blank. And then when we go into the next level down within our rating configuration pyramid here, we've got the rate master. So you can see that that's defined on my profile. So if I click the hyperlink there, it's going to take me to my rate master. So here our tip was to verify the rating metadata that is set up. So all of this demo data that I'm showing you here is just our Contoso data. It will be populated if you click that initialize base engine data. So you should be able to hop into your own demo environment and see this same data if you would like to follow along or review this later. But so I can view the rating metadata again through a hyperlink or through the button at the top of the form. And if I come in here, as we mentioned earlier, all the metadata is really defining is what is mandatory to be populated both on my rate-based assignment. So on the assignment, I can see that my mandatory is checked for my postal code from the origin, so the pickup postal code and the pickup country. I have some other fields that are in here, so these will show up as columns on my rate-based assignment, but they are not mandatory for me to fill in. But I must at least have a postal code and a country defined. That's on my assignment. And then if I look at the rate base, it also has metadata that defines which fields are mandatory. So in this case, you can see I've got several fields that are here, but they are not all mandatory. In this case, we have mandatory fields, again, of the postal code and the country, this time for the drop-off. So this is my destination kind of address information, and then the rate itself. So that's the metadata that's telling me what is mandatory for me to define. So if I click to exit that form, which will take me back to my rating master, I can see my rate-based assignments. So here you can easily see that one-to-many relationship. So this whole form is my master. And then this tab is showing me the rate-based assignments. And I've even got a count up here in the overview tab of how many rate bases and assignments are related to this master. So if I scroll across, you'll start to see the column headers are those fields that were identified in the rating metadata, right? So for the rate-based assignment, we had the pickup city, state, postal code, and country, but only these fields are mandatory, so I do not have to populate these. And here are those effective date and times that we talked about, just leaving blank. That way you can go ahead and do your testing and have a little bit easier time troubleshooting if there are any issues. So the next level down in our hierarchy, you'll see that here's that one-to-one relationship between my rate-based assignment and my base. And I can get there again, just like the metadata, either through the hyperlink or the button at the top of the form. So as I go into my rate base, I can see this record down here is my rate base detail. And again, these column headings are coming from that rating metadata that is defined. So I've got drop off, city, state, postal code. And in this case, I actually have a postal code range that I am dropping off to that all apply to this rate. So I've got a pickup at a certain origin, which is likely my warehouse or some other hub, and then a drop off anywhere within this postal code range in Germany. And then this set of columns here are not defined by the rating metadata, but by the break master. So that's that very lowest level we talked about in the setup, and you can see it up here in the general tab of the rate base. So if we open that break master, you can see that it has defined kind of all of those buckets or those breaks in values defined here at the bottom. And our tip was to make sure that your break unit that you identify relates to the right data type, right? So this one is pounds, and we have chosen a real number here. The other options we have are to do an integer or a string value. So depending on what your break master is for, maybe it's for mileage, right, and not for pounds. So that will change this setup. I do also get to indicate the comparison, right? So is it a less than these values? Is it equal to these values? You can define those ranges in those buckets. So if I close out of this form and I go back, so again, these fields here, so that should start to make sense, that each of those breaks that I defined in my break master are shown here with the relevant comparison. So I used a less than, my real number here, and my break unit of pounds. So this is how this reads, is anything less than a pound that is being rated is going to be assigned a freight charge of 50 US dollars, because that's my currency, per whatever the weight is in pounds. And then as I go along my scale, now I've got a bucket that says anything less than 5 pounds. So that essentially includes like 1 up to 4.99 pounds. It's going to get a freight charge of 20 US dollars times whatever the weight is. So if we've got something that's 3 pounds and it falls into this bucket, I'm going to get that 20 US dollars times 3 pounds. And my rating action is going to return a freight charge to me of 60 US dollars, 3 pounds times the $20 rate base here. So hopefully that clarifies kind of the difference on this rate-based record of what is coming from the metadata and what is coming from the break master. But ultimately, this data here defined with the rates is really the heart of the whole rating process and configuration, right? So we started at the top level of that rating profile. We have our rate masters, our rate-based assignments, our bases, and ultimately all of that is being evaluated in that query structure that we talked about earlier to ultimately return a rate to us using this data here. Okay, so we did also talk about, again, here are those effective dates on the rate base itself. Go ahead and leave them blank as you're troubleshooting. All right, so that is all of our rating configuration. So let's go ahead and go back to our PowerPoint presentation and talk about routing. So when we start with routing, the top of our pyramid is the routing guide, and that's what we've shown here on the right-hand side in the screen capture. So our tip for the routing guide is to define the direction that the routing guide applies to. So you've got a field, and might be a little bit small to see in the screenshot, but we'll show it in the system as well. But you've got a selection here for the direction to either be inbound or outbound, or we have a third option to say that it's none, which really means it applies to both. So that might be a little bit misleading, but if you select the value of none, that means that the routing guide can apply to both inbound and outbound loads. So the reason that we say to go ahead and define a direction instead of using that none value is because as you are routing a load and the system is trying to evaluate, all of these different routing guides that you may have configured in the system, it's just going to cut down on that processing time, right? If I've got an inbound load and all of my routing guides are set to none, then it's got to go through and evaluate every one until it finds a match. But if I instead have, some subsection of all of my routing guides that are only applicable to inbound loads, now the system can start with that subset instead of having to process all the ones that say none or outbound, right? That just don't apply. And then the next level in our routing hierarchy is the route plan. So the routing plan is what contains those route segments, so our origin and our destination hubs. But the nice thing within our routing plan is it's also the structure that allows us to define rates that may go along with those routing segments. So we have a tip here that says to go ahead and add spot rates for your segments to your routing plan if they apply, right? So if I've got a segment within a route plan that says something is going from my warehouse in Seattle, Washington, in the United States, to the port of Seattle, because it's going to be transferred to an ocean container. And that first segment from my warehouse to the port is via truck. Then maybe I've got a spot rate, at the hub for an unloading charge, right? And that always applies at that hub, and I can just go ahead and define it as a spot rate. So now when I route my load in the system, and this routing plan is ultimately assigned to my load, it can also pick up that spot rate and assign it as well, so that I can capture that charge. And then with the hubs that we talked about, so you're going to have that origin and destination hub on every segment of your route. And what you want to make sure with the hubs as you're setting them up in the system is that you're populating the address information. You can see from the configurations that we reviewed earlier on the rating that a lot of it is typically driven by address information, right? Postal code or country or city and state. So when we start looking at routing, our hubs, being our origin and our destination point, need to have that same kind of level of address information, just like our warehouse and our end customer accounts would have. And then for the routing schedules, which are, again, they're tied to that route plan. These are optional. I won't say that these are necessarily mandatory, because not everybody has a distribution scenario that necessitates a routing schedule. But this would be more for maybe you're a retailer and you've got a distribution center that sends inventory to replenish your stores, and that happens on a regular recurrence every week, or whatever the frequency is. Or maybe you're just kind of in a hub and spoke distribution model where you've got a centralized DC and some smaller sites that you send inventory to. And again, that may be happening on just a regular recurrence. You can go ahead and set those up as route schedules. And that way, what's going to happen is when the system evaluates, starting with the routing guide, and then it goes to a routing plan, it's going to see that you have a route schedule defined. And if today was Friday, and my next scheduled route leaves next Tuesday, because I send inventory to my stores every Tuesday and Thursday, then it's not going to tell me to put my load on this route today or even Monday, right? It's going to assign me the next scheduled route, which is next Tuesday. And then one last thing I want to talk about that seems unrelated, but it is a TMS configuration, and within our setup forms within the module, it does actually fall under the routing category. So that's why I'm going to talk about it here. But it is the constraints. So the constraints allow you to define item level and or shipment level restrictions for shipping, right? So if I've got an item that is a particular category, like a hazardous good, right, then I can define a restriction that says that item cannot be shipped via air, right? Because that hazardous good can't go into a pressurized air cargo cabin. And similarly with shipment restrictions, I might have a scenario where certain shipments to certain customer accounts, I only want to ship full truckload, right? So I want to limit the mode of transportation to that customer and not allow like less than truckload shipments to go to those customers. And that might be in scenarios like if you're a supplier to a huge retailer like a Walmart, right? They don't want to receive these small shipments. They would rather have you accumulate, right, enough to have a full truckload to ship them one full shipment. So that's the functionality of the constraints. So let's hop back into our system and talk about these routing forms so I can show them to you guys. Refresh our system for routing. So again, I had a direct link here to just that top level of our routing pyramid, which is the routing guides. But these, again, are in transportation management, setup, and then under routing, the very first form is the routing guide that I'm showing here. So if I just look at this very first record, which is just a test one that I configured, our first tip was to go ahead and define that direction. So here's that drop down. You can see those values available here. So inbound, outbound, or none. And then if we look through this form, essentially all of the tabs here at the top of the form, account, origin, destination, weight and volume limits, are all criteria that can be defined. So you can use as much or as little of this information as you want to define what this routing guide applies to. So mine, I have, again, kind of similar to our rating setup, left the site and warehouse blank so that this can apply across different sites and warehouses within my network. But what I have defined is just a customer account. And then if I scroll to the bottom, the result tab is basically telling the system, hey, when you evaluate all of the criteria here and match it against the load, right, that we're trying to route, then what is the result, right? If I have a match between my load and this criteria, what is the ultimate result? And in this case, for my test scenario, I have just said, I want to ship to that customer a full truckload. So I've used the truckload mode. So that's kind of like those constraints that we were talking about just now. But if I look at another example here, this one has some different criteria filled in. You can see it's got an origin postal code and a range of destination postal codes. And what the result is a routing plan. So this is a pretty common setup within the routing guide and routing plan structure, is to, instead of specifying, you know, a certain mode or specific carrier like I did in my test routing guide, that I actually point it to a resulting route plan. And I can open that up by clicking the hyperlink. And this is showing those segments. So here's that one-to-many relationship between my route plan, which is this kind of this whole form here, and then my segments, which are these individual sequences. So I can see here that I have got multiple hubs. So again, that kind of one-to-many relationship with the hubs on every segment. So I've got, in this case, a route that tells me I'm going from my hub of my warehouse to a hub in San Francisco, and I'm gonna do that segment via a rail carrier service. And then from that hub in San Francisco, I ultimately am going to a destination hub in Georgia, and that part of my segment is going to be via truck. So this is over the road, and that's a truckload. So one of the things that we mentioned in the tips for the routing plan was to go ahead and set up these spot rates. So you can see we've got a button here that allows me to see what the spot rates are that are configured. So I can define an actual specific rate charge here that applies to this segment, or I can define an accessorial charge. If you're familiar with the kind of extended rating setups and accessorials, these are kind of outside of the freight charge that's calculated in the rating setups. Accessorials are these additional charges other than freight. So they might be fuel surcharges, they might be lift gate charges that the carrier charges when they dock into your warehouse dock door. So anything like that, these accessorial charges can also be defined as a spot rate on the actual segment. So again, that's just helping you capture any of those kind of miscellaneous transportation costs along the route. You can see here again, they've got effective dates and times. Same comment is going to apply. Go ahead and leave those blank for your own sanity, really. And if we scroll across here, you can see some of what I was talking about earlier, where our segments not only allow us to define kind of our origin and our destination, based on like location and carrier and mode of transport, but also what are the delivery terms and who's responsible for payment of each of these segments, right? If I have a freight forwarder in here, then I might have a different person responsible for payment. And then I can specify invoice accounts. And that way, when I'm doing my freight reconciliation at the end of all of this, it's going to be charged to the right accounts and to the right parties. So we had another tip about the hubs specifically and their address information. So again, I can click a hyperlink to get into the detail, or I do have this edit hubs button. And when I click that, it's going to show me all of the hubs that are within that total route plan. And I can click on any one of them to open it. And it's going to show me the detail of that hub. So what type of hub is it? And these hub types are, again, user defined. So we talked about earlier that these may be things like warehouses or ports or rail yards, and any of those things can be hubs. And so you can define the types, but then really kind of most importantly, we want to make sure that we're filling in the address information. And you can see here that we didn't go to the level to define like the street number and name in the address, but we've at least defined the city, state, postal code, and country so that we have a match to some of that mandatory information from the rate base assignments and the rate bases, so that when all of this is evaluated together, we can get an appropriate match, right? And we can get a rate along with our route. So that's why it's important to make sure you have addresses on your hubs. All right, and then let's talk about the route schedules. So again, these are optional. They don't apply to everybody's distribution scenarios, but if they do apply and you are using them, you would access them from within your route plan, and then you would click the route schedules button at the top. And our tip was to make sure, when you set all this up, you want to make sure that you go ahead and activate this route recurrence at the top of the form, because if you do not, even if all of this is populated, when you go to do a routing exercise for your load and you find a route plan and it has these scheduled routes, it's not going to return one of these for you unless you have this activated up here at the top. So the recurrence pattern is just allowing you to define, you can see this one is a weekly Tuesday, Thursday, and I've defined a certain time period here kind of through the end of the year. And once you initially set up these parameters at the bottom, this part of the form is blank to begin with. And then you would click generate routes, and it's going to go through and fill in that recurrence within that time frame. So here are all of the available routes upcoming through the end of that time frame. So today is November 20th. So actually my next scheduled route is next Tuesday, November 24th. I've got another example in here. It's similar, but it's on a different recurrence, just a Monday, Wednesday, Friday recurrence instead of Tuesday, Thursday. And again, you can see it's populated all of those Monday, Wednesday, Friday scheduled routes for me down here at the bottom. So that's the setup for the route schedule if you are using it. And again, that has a one-to-one relationship here with the route plan, but the route schedules themselves have that one-to-many relationships with these scheduled routes down here at the bottom. Okay, and then finally, our last tip that we were talking about was constraints. So let me show you where those are set up. So we're in transportation management setup, and under the routing tab, we've got this constraints form. So here you can see on the left-hand side of the form, I've got item level constraints and shipment level constraints. So if I look at just the item level constraints, you can see I've got an example here where I'm doing a constraint by the filter code on the item. So these are our 4 filter codes that we use with WMS, our warehouse management enabled items. So if I have a filter code defined for hazardous goods, then here in my constraint, I've said that any item with that specific hazardous code for code 1 cannot be shipped via this air cargo carrier, which has a mode of air. And I am actually going to put a hard stop to that action. So I've got a restrict or a warn action that I can take, but I'm actually going to restrict the user from assigning, a load that has any items with this filter code to an air carrier. If I look at this other one that's in here, this is actually saying for a specific item, restrict it from being shipped through this hub. And then if we look at the shipment scenario instead, we can see here we've got an example where we've got a specific customer account defined. And this is, again, if you remember from my routing guide that I showed earlier, this is the same customer account where I said the result of that criteria was that I wanted to ship it full truckload. So this is a kind of corresponding setup where I say that for that customer account, I have actually put in a warning in my shipment constraints that says, warn me if I try to ship to that customer via LTL, so less than truckload, present a warning to me, but do not give me a hard stop or restrict me from doing that. So maybe I typically ship them full truckload and for some reason we've got an urgent shipment that needs to go out. We don't quite have a full truckload and I do want to ship to this customer LTL. I could still do it with this warning level constraint in place. All right, so that is everything for the routing side. And while I'm in the system, I just want to point out one other thing, because we've mentioned it a few times in the presentation, and that's that initialize base engine data. That button is in the transportation management module parameters, as we mentioned, and it's down here on the general tab under engines, and you've got this initialize base engine data. If it's already been run for the environment, don't hesitate to click it again, because you're going to get a little warning that kind of says, do you want to do this? And you could say yes or no. So I'll say no, so it doesn't kick off that process again. Okay, so that is where that button is at. And then let me show one other thing in the system here. And that is just to kind of hopefully tie all of the things that we've been talking about together. So we talked about rating configurations, we talked about routing configurations, and really all of that is the kind of back end setup that is required to do the functions from our rate route workbench. So in transportation management, under the planning tab, you've got your rate route workbench. You can get to this workbench from a lot of different places, right? I can access this from my load planning workbench, from my shipments, my loads, even my directly from my orders. And the nice thing about accessing this workbench from some of those other origin points is that it's going to fill in the related information from where I came from. So it's going to have like that records information for me populated up here at the top. Because you can see otherwise, if I come directly to this workbench, all of this criteria tab is blank. And so I would have to start, kind of manually filling this in by hand, which is, certainly a lot harder to do, right? It just is a lot more time consuming. I could certainly still try to pull up some stuff here. But if I come from a certain record, right, it's going to have, all of the information about the weight of the shipment in there for me. And so then this is really the origin point of our rating and routing actions that are being triggered. So if you attended the transportation management introduction tech talk that we did a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the differences in these functions here on this workbench. So, what is the difference between these rating options and these different routing options? So go ahead, there's a recording out on the community dynamics page that you can review if you did not see that or want a refresher. But really, these are the triggers for rating and routing, right? So if I click rate on this form, what's happening in the background is that whole query structure, right, that we define, the rating profile through the rate master, the rate base assignments, the rate bases and the break masters, all of that together gets evaluated against this criteria that we've defined. And then it's trying to return a result down here. So that looks like a very simple action, right? To click rate and to get a result. And you can see I picked a from my warehouse to this customer, and I just kind of filled in a weight of 30 pounds here. But it did return a parcel carrier with a rate of $1,520, which is awfully high for a parcel carrier, but I guess it should 30 pounds. But it is shipping from Washington down to California. But we also have routing actions up here at the top, right? So similarly, if I trigger one of these routing actions, it may not look like anything's really happening, but in the background, it's evaluating that whole query structure for routing. So starting with routing guides through to our routing plans, our segments, any route schedules we've defined, and it's returning my routing options here to me at the bottom. And I can see that, for each of those route plans that it's defined here, the segments that are defined can be viewed down here in the segments tab. So, and as I click through, you can see how they are different between those different routing plans. So as a logistics coordinator, a transportation manager, if I'm working in this workbench to do rating or routing, or rating and routing at the same time, if we configured both, then this is ultimately the action that I'm taking, and then I'm going to go ahead and select, whichever one applies, and I'm going to assign it to my load that I'm planning. And that way we've captured the charges, we've captured the route, and now we have got that data tied to our load. So again, these look like simple actions to trigger, but everything that we have spent the last 50 minutes or so talking about here is what's really being evaluated in the background. So it's all very critical. It's critical that we get every piece of those configurations set up, and we get them set up appropriately so that the system can evaluate them. All right, so with that, I am going to come back to our PowerPoint presentation, and then I'm going to pause. I think we do have a few minutes here. Aaron, do we have any Q&A that we can address here?
Yep, I've been holding some for you.
Okay.
First question is, I guess there's a couple of different questions, and it relates to if you set up rating and routing, is there any effect, or can you have those, let's say if you rate and you want to charge the freight charges to the customer, is there a way to get those charges back over onto the sales order at all? And then also a corresponding question, if you're using the routing, if the shipment on a sales order, does that somehow update the mode of delivery or things of that nature on the sales order if you have those enabled?
Yeah, good questions. We didn't specifically go into those topics today, and the reason is we're anticipating that we're going to have another tech talk for transportation management configuration specific to freight reconciliation. So we will talk more about, the actual freight charges, how they apportion back to the source order lines, and those types of concepts. But just to address the question, if you have a rate and you assign it, right? So if I'm on that rate route workbench, I have a rate that was returned to me down here, and I assign it. What happens is that, and let me see if I've actually got an example in that I can go to for you. But what happens is when you assign it to your load, there is a record that's created in the system, and it's called a route record, which can be a bit confusing if you're just rating, but it does capture rating and routing information, and it is tied to your load. So that's the relationship, and the freight charge does get a portion back to the sales order line. So those would be your load lines that are on your load. So yes, they are all connected. And let me see if I've just got a load that's already down here. Maybe that's already loaded. We'll see if we've got anything. we'll go for that. Okay, let's see if we can open up our rating. So this would be that rating and routing workbench, going directly from our load planning workbench. So you can see the difference now is that I've got this pre-populated information, and now if I rate, right, here's that result that was returned, and I can assign that to this load. And what you'll see is that it actually is going to bring up that route record that is created, and it's going to show me that detail. So it's going to show me the rate here. All right. So yes, because we have that route record, the load is updated. And as far as a freight charge, it does get apportioned back. And stay tuned and look for the freight reconciliation. TechTalk, definitely give us feedback in the survey after this session if you are interested in that, because we're looking at that as far as you know, our next upcoming TechTalks on our schedule.
Okay, I'll maybe try to grab another shorter one. I've been holding a few questions, so if you haven't had your question answered yet, we'll still be addressing those after the session today, but I just want to make sure we had enough for the Q&A session here. On one of the other ones, how about on the route schedule? Is it possible to close some of the scheduled dates, e.g. due to like a national holiday or where trucks aren't traveling? Can you adjust those routes?
So not within the route schedule setup itself. So if I go back and look at like a route plan, this one has a schedule, right? There's no other like functionality on here for me to say, you know, this 11/26 date, right? That's a US holiday, that's Thanksgiving here next week. So if I don't want to ship on that day, I would probably need to make use of a combination of like my working time calendars, right? Because those are also all evaluated within my transportation management setup. So if I've got calendars configured that says, you know, I'm closed on this day, then even though this is like an option because it's every Tuesday, Thursday, I'm not going to be shipping on that day because I said I'm closed for shipping that day. So it's not directly on there, but TMS and the rating and routing functionalities do honor any working time calendars that you have configured for the warehouse.
I don't know, maybe one more quick one, I guess. In the routing setup, is it possible to define transportation time between, you know, example warehouses or hub to hub?
Yes, and so that's actually a great question, and I actually just opened this here. You can see under our engines, and when we do that initial base engine data setup, it's not only our rating engines that get configured, but we do have a transit time engine in TMS, and you can see that this basically defines, like, via service, you know, how long does it take to get between any origin and destination, right? So if I'm going air, that's 1 day, right? Let me maybe filter this and see if we've got, okay, so we've got air, we've got an LTL truck. I'm hard pressed to believe that that's less than the air, but maybe that's because it's a shorter distance. And then we've got a standard and like a full truckload. So you can define within this transit time engine what those transit days are. And then they are calculated, and actually it was populated on the route record that I just created when we went to the load planning workbench and opened up our rating and routing workbench. And I clicked rate to get that freight charge. But what also happened is my rating profile is set up with a transit time engine. And so you'll actually see that it calculated the mileage between my origin and destination was 500 miles, and the transit days is 1 day from that transit time engine. So yes, you can essentially kind of do all of those evaluations and calculations like within one action.
Great, thanks, Nicole. I think we're pretty much at time, so I'll let you wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, and great questions. I will go back. I'm going to put up just my contact information here. So feel free to reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn. And thanks for joining the session today. So I will kick it back to Evan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicole. We would like to get your feedback on today's session. I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We value your feedback and welcome your input on how we did today and what you would like to see in future sessions. That survey scores on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible, and we thank you for your participation in that. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the TechTalk's Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Nicole, and a thank you to our audience for logging in and joining us today. Please stay safe and have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.